Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's event. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Driving Innovation, How Can Private and Public Sector Speed EV Deployment? My name is Rebecca Lorenzen. I'm the Policy Manager with CRES, Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions Forum. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that educates the public and influences the national conversation around clean energy solutions that are actionable, market-friendly, and responsible. Charles Hernick, Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at CRES Forum, will be our moderator today. Just a few brief housekeeping notes before we begin. As attendees, you are muted. However, we encourage your participation. There is a Q&A box for attendees who would like to ask questions at the end of the discussion. And if you have any technical difficulties, please message me through the chat. We encourage you to participate on social media as well with the Twitter handle CRES Forum and hashtag Clean Energy. Without further ado, I will now give the floor to Charles.
Thanks, Rebecca. And that timing worked out perfectly. It is noon now Eastern time. My name is Charles Hernick. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy with Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. And the topic of today's session is driving innovation, how private and public sectors can speed EV deployment. And this is a very timely conversation. Later this afternoon, President Biden will roll out part one of his infrastructure plan. And it includes some of the things that we're going to talk about. Some items on tax credits and incentives, some items on charging infrastructure. We haven't prepared our remarks or focused on this infrastructure package yet since it's not fully out. So we won't provide comments on electrification of the Postal Service or anything like that. But we are interested in diving in deep on what the future of clean energy looks like in the transportation sector. There are two parts to today's conversation. Part one is going to be a panel discussion that's going to focus on some of the items that I mentioned already and how this transition will unfold. Our panelists are Jamie Hall, who is the Advanced Vehicle and Infrastructure Policy Manager with General Motors, Natasha Vidangos, Vice President of Research and Analysis with the Alliance to Save Energy, Paul Allen with the Coalition for a Better Business Environment, and Karen Glitman, Senior Director of Transportation and DER Markets for the Center for Sustainable Energy. We'll have 10 minutes after our panel conversation for questions and answers from the audience. So please do participate. You'll see a chat box and please do jump in with any questions that you do have for our expert panelists here. And then we'll wrap up. We're holding the last 10 minutes for a model demonstration, which is something new that we're interested in trying out here, to look at the Caret tool developed by the Center for Sustainable Energy, which seeks to provide certainty to policymakers designing EV incentive programs by allowing them to test different combinations of incentives and predict what results they're likely to obtain. So a very important and very timely conversation that we're having today. In no small part because climate change is top of the radar for a lot of Americans and politicians across the United States. Number one source of greenhouse gas emissions is transportation. And so it's a necessary focus for us. And in 2016, transportation overtook the power sector. And the arrow is still pointed up. Power sector decarbonization is coming along nicely. More needs to be done, of course. But transportation is really on the front edge of where we need to be in terms of making that transition to clean energy. And it's difficult. Americans love their automobiles, which makes any policy that touches automobiles very sensitive for people in urban areas, in rural areas. And so we want to think about what the different policy levers are to drive emissions down in the transportation sector. They are increasing fuel efficiency, better utilization of alternative fuels, fuel switching to hydrogen, to propane, things like that, and also pursuing electric vehicles. In other conversations we've had at CRES Forum, we focused on number one and number two, and today we're focusing squarely on number three, the future of electric vehicles in the United States. And it matters because today electric vehicles are just simply more cost effective than they ever have been before. Prices are coming down for the inputs that go into manufacturing the vehicles, but the price point for families is also starting to make more and more sense Drivers are estimated to save between $800 and $1,000 per year in fuel alone. So paying for their electricity bill instead of paying at the pump like folks are used to. The other thing about electric vehicles, they're just fun to drive. Jay Leno, car collector, car enthusiast, had a column at the beginning of the year that I remember reading that just focused on electric vehicles and that fun element of it. So when you're getting to the heart of what Americans want, it's an important part of the future for sure. This transformation and transition that's underway is going to take a lot of different elements, private sector and public sector, and this is where we're trying to dive in and better understand it. There are more and more companies that are pledging to go 100% electric. There's been more innovation. There are more options for drivers to choose from. And there are favorable federal and state policies. Later today, President Biden will talk about a couple of the federal policies, and we'll dive into some of the other ones that may or may not be on the table. We will see. Without further ado, I want to shift over to our panel of experts here to share their perspective on electrification. And so we'll do a round robin here, and I'll start at the top and ask for each of you to introduce yourself and your organization and add a little bit of color on how the private and public sectors can speed EV deployment. Jamie, I'll start with you. And it's clear that General Motors is turning heads with the, you go to the website, all electric future is everywhere on the website. Looking at 30 EV models by 2025. Fantastic Super Bowl ad with Will Ferrell picking a fight with Norway, of all places. Turning heads, what is most exciting to you about this transition that General Motors is undertaking? What are some of the first technological barriers that GM is working to overcome? And what's really behind this strategy overall? Jamie, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today and for sort of good setting of the stage. So I get to work on policies and programs to grow the EV market, and this is a pretty cool thing to be working on at this moment in time and at a company that is really all committed. As you noted, GM does believe the future is all electric, and we're working hard to make this a reality. We think to actually get there, I mean, this is sort of a no-brainer. We've got to get to the point where EVs can meet everyone's needs, and this means longer range. It means more types of vehicles in different segments of the market. It means a seamless charging experience, and it means having all of this at a price point that makes sense for people. So this is where we think we need to head as a company, both to hit climate goals and both because this just is the future. EVs ultimately will just be better vehicles. But we've got to make progress on all of those things that I mentioned, the range, the vehicle offerings and the charging experience. And we are first and foremost, as I think you might expect, focusing on the vehicles. This is where we as an automaker can make the biggest difference. We recently announced a significantly increased investment in electric and autonomous vehicle technology, bringing the total to $27 billion through 2025. And as you mentioned, this will include 30 new models globally. We're now investing more in these EV and AV products than we are in conventional technology. So I really see this as a turning point. And honestly, I have a hard time even internally keeping up with all the announcements just in the course of this year. And that's an exciting problem to have, not being able to keep up with all of your own announcements. One big piece of this is ongoing work to improve range and reduce battery costs. So we announced a $2.3 billion plant in Lordstown with LG Chem to produce battery cells. We're working to improve the batteries and the propulsion system with our new Ultium platform, which was unveiled just over a year ago, just before COVID shut down travel. I think that was my last work trip, was getting to see the Ultium platform and a lot of these new vehicles at what we called EV Days in Detroit last March, which really feels like another lifetime. This platform is really flexible, reduces complexity. You can stack the batteries in different ways, and that allows it to be very versatile, and we can use it in all different vehicle platforms. The first Ultium-based products go on sale later this year. And our vehicle portfolio is growing really rapidly. You're going to see more variety, more vehicles at different price points, and they'll just be all around better. One of those, I'll note, the Hummer EV SUV is being unveiled this weekend. So check it out. You can place a reservation. I also want to note this is not limited to passenger vehicles. We also recently announced BrightDrop, which is a whole new business with an ecosystem of electric products and software and services focused on delivery. So it's really exciting. That's a bit of what we're doing on the vehicle side, but that's just one piece of this. And we also need to get communities ready to support EVs. A big piece of that will be infrastructure. EVs, you need to be able to charge quickly and easily at home and at work and on the go. And we're working on solutions for all of this. Just as one example, we announced a partnership with EVgo to build out an additional 2,700 DC fast chargers in major metropolitan areas across the country. But that's really just a start. There's a lot more work that needs to be done on infrastructure deployment and related issues around grid upgrades, electricity rates, and sort of vehicle grid integration. So I guess I'll just conclude my sort of intro by turning to the topic of this panel. How can the public and private sectors work together? We're all in and we're putting real resources behind this, but we can't do it alone. And we think there's going to be a real need for public-private collaboration at all levels of government on what we like to call the 3 I's. So that's infrastructure to meet the consumer needs, incentives to bring down costs and drive sales in the near term, and investment in battery research and manufacturing and supply chain. I've been working to sort of accelerate this change for the last decade. I've never been as optimistic as I am right now. It really feels like a turning point. So excited to have the discussion today, and thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. And a couple of things that you mentioned there really do resonate with me. Your point that they're likely to be just better vehicles resonates a lot because we know that customers shop on price. I shop on price. But more and more with climate change in the backdrop, folks are interested in the quality attributes of what they're buying. And from a climate standpoint, that does matter and resonates with electric vehicles too, the lower maintenance, all of that. And $27 billion is a staggering figure. That's a huge investment, and that's great to see the private sector push with that much force. One company alone can do a lot, and so it's great to see that. And I think it cues up nicely. Natasha, I'll shift over to you, and maybe we can start at the federal level and talk a little bit about policy. If you could tell us a little bit about the 50 by 50 network that you all are helping to lead up, and maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the federal incentives that we're likely to see discussed later today. There are also incentives for some of the infrastructure that Jamie mentioned, a 30C tax credit. But we need to be able to build this stuff too. And so I'm not sure if there are permitting issues that we're likely to come up against. And if you could speak to any of that, that'd be great.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. So my name is Natasha Vidangos. I'm Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Alliance to Save Energy. We're a bipartisan nonprofit that advocates for energy efficiency. We basically view it as the world will be better if we use our energy better. In this case, we started an initiative called the 50 by 50 Transportation Initiative back in 2018. It's an industry coalition that's dedicated to making the transportation sector more efficient overall by trying to achieve a goal of cutting transportation energy consumption by 50% by 2050. And this is a goal that requires you to use basically every tool on the table, and we went well beyond electrification. We talked about optimizing energy in cities and public transportation and active modes and thinking about freight and fuel economy standards, basically every tool that we have in the kit. But across the board, electrification very often was one of the opportunities that gives you the greatest leap forward in terms of using your energy more efficiently. It's a really remarkable opportunity to have far lower fuel costs, far lower emissions, and we're really seeing this transformation happening. I will flag that GM is a part of the initiative, and so I always enjoy hearing Jamie and his colleagues talk about this because there's a lot to learn. But overall, what you're hearing, the industry is really bullish on this. This is a really exciting market. Battery costs are falling rapidly. Charles, as you said, the opportunity for for families to consider an EV as a family solution for their transportation needs is increasing. Great opportunities coming on fleets. Greater opportunities are starting to appear on the horizon, even in the heavier duty sectors. And this isn't just automakers that are excited. We're also seeing a lot of energy at utilities, technology companies, logistics firms, battery manufacturers, ports and airports. Even local governments are getting really interested in these opportunities because it often implies a lower rate of operating costs and a better use of their taxpayer dollars. So electrification can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but there are many different kinds of positives that are creating this enthusiasm. And that's really exciting. There's a quote that gets sort of batted around DC that if you're ready for it, it's a transition, and if you're not, it's a disruption. I think that's very true in this case, and there's real value in trying to get as many folks around the table, as many stakeholders united around a vision of how we can make this work for everybody and make it move forward in the most efficacious, most effective, and most coordinated way. And the challenge here, of course, is that you've got two very different sectors that traditionally have not been closely linked that now need to be closely linked. Power and transportation used to be considered very, very different spaces with different languages, different priorities. Now we're bringing them together. So how do you take care of, producing the EVs, getting them for consumers, making it work, all of the points that Jamie made, but also ensure that the charging availability is there, that it works with the grid, that you take the greatest opportunity there. And there's even an additional conversation about how electric vehicles really can be a grid resource going forward. That's kind of a mind-blowing concept for those of us who have thought about energy efficiency in buildings for years, that all of a sudden that transportation asset may actually be one of the most powerful transformative assets going forward when you're thinking about demand response, demand flexibility, and beyond. So, how do we actually move this forward? What does the future look like for the coming 10 years? There are estimates out there from Brattle recently that we may reach the parity of the sticker price of electric and conventional vehicles even as soon as 2025. It's coming, and it's coming fast. So how do we ensure that we move this forward in the most effective way? And there are many different programs that are useful. There are direct infrastructure spending opportunities. Build grants are very popular. They're often massively oversubscribed. They give a great deal of flexibility to those on the ground who are really making the investments, something that we really advocate for. Programs even such as CMAQ and DERA are really important. The tax incentives that you mentioned, Charles, 30C, 30D. But we also need to think about using financing tools effectively. The Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, TIFIA, could always be used better. We could think about reinstating Build America bonds. So there are many different examples of how you can move it forward. But at the end of the day, the key is really to stay coordinated, keep an eye on the ball, and have a vision for how we can make this work really for everybody. Thanks.
Thanks, Natasha. That's super helpful perspective there. And I do like your point that it's a transition if you're prepared and a disruption if you're not. And certainly we're all working for the former. But I think that your point that the need to firm up the nexus between the power sector and the transportation sector is really a big part of what's at stake here in making this transition successful. And with that, I want to shift over to you, Paul. I know that you're with the Coalition for a Better Business Environment. You have some of both in your coalition and focused on the Transportation Climate Initiative, which we've talked about in past CRES Forum virtual events. But if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your perspective on what's going on at the state level, how some state regional activities can be complementary to what we're seeing and what we're likely to hear President Biden talk about at the federal level later today.
Yeah, thanks very much, Charles, and thanks everyone for joining and listening to this conversation. It is super relevant, and it's also nice to see some familiar faces here today. Natasha and I have worked together in the past quite successfully. I'll say a little bit more about the Coalition for a Better Business Environment. Just first, very quickly, I'm a senior vice president at MJ Bradley and Associates. We are a private consulting firm that has worked for 25 years with primarily with the electric power sector, but also with oil and natural gas, as well as having a specialty in transportation. For many years, the transportation work that we did was really around heavy engines, by which I mean locomotives, ocean-going vessels, ferry boats, and so forth. And a lot of it focused on transit agencies. So working with municipal transit agencies on, 10 years ago, it was integrating hybrid buses. Now it's very much about electric drive chains. I want to make an observation that kind of leads to how the Coalition for a Better Business Environment came about, but also about what policymaking at the state level feels like, particularly from the point of view of the electric companies. 5 or 6 years ago, electric companies were still not persuaded that the transition to electricity was going to be a material matter for them within their planning cycles. That began to change, and it has now changed in a very major way. But from the point of view of an electric power company, a lot of the actual preparation for making sure that vehicles can be smoothly integrated into the grid requires persuading public service regulators to approve new investments by the electric utility company in charging infrastructure and in other equipment that is still a little difficult to predict precisely how it's going to be used. And this is particularly true as we are now in the past, I would say 18 months or so, seeing a major uptick in the interest in medium and heavy duty vehicles and large fleet integration. And maybe we can say a little bit more about that later in our discussion. 1 year ago, almost to the day, the Coalition for a Better Business Environment began to come about through discussions that some of our electric companies, National Grid, Exelon, Eversource, and others, were having with Greenlots. And with Greenlots is a software provider in the electric vehicle charging infrastructure space. Greenlots was acquired by Shell. We were interested in what Shell's viewpoint would be about the Transportation Climate Initiative. The Transportation Climate Initiative, Charles mentioned that the CRES Forum has focused on this a bit in the past, but just as a quick reminder, it's a program of a cap and invest for lowering the emissions from fossil fuel motor fuels. And it would do this in two ways. One, by auctioning off allowances that the wholesale fuel suppliers would need to acquire through auctions by the states. And then the states would invest the money in clean transportation initiatives. So about a year ago, in conversations with Greenlots and Shell, the electric companies, and several others, including BP, and with very helpful input from the nonprofit series and from also from Bank of America, we thought it would be incredibly helpful to have a place where the motor fuel suppliers and the electricity suppliers could come together to talk about their mutual interests. Sometimes they diverge, of course, but also to begin to be a business voice to the state leadership to let them know that, in fact, the investment dollars from TCI could be incredibly helpful in providing exactly the 3 I's that Jamie talked about. So there need to be incentives still. There definitely needs to be infrastructure, and there needs to be a source to augment investment from the private sector. And so this is a way of accomplishing all of those things sort of simultaneously. What the coalition has done is we've launched a website, we've stood up an advertising campaign, we have direct conversations with state leaderships and with governors. We work quite closely with the Georgetown Climate Center, who is the facilitator of the process for formulating TCI. We think this is an indispensable program. We certainly think that policy intervention and policy guidance is going to continue to be necessary as we make this transition so that it's as little disruptive as possible. Let's put it that way. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to get that specificity and to understand a little bit better about what the Transportation Climate Initiative offers for that state level investment. It's not just up to the federal government. States are very different. The roads and highways across America are very much different too. But good to see you kind of double down here too on these 3 I's, focusing on the incentives, the infrastructure, and the investment. That there are opportunities at every level, state, federal, to be able to work with the private sector and assure that we're getting a good return on investment for what we're doing. So Karen, that leads me over to you. And I want to have you speak a little bit more about the data. And I know that at the Center for Sustainable Energy, and we'll get to the model later in the presentation here, but you all have taken a very close and firm look at better understanding how to get the best return on investment, which knobs to turn, which knobs can be turned, which knobs should be turned. What's the difference between a coupon that you might get, a discount at the point of sale? Folks respond very differently to those kinds of different incentives. And I'm hoping that you can speak a little bit about that. As a fiscal conservative, it makes me anxious when I see giant price tags associated with federal or state programs. But if we can assure that the money is well spent, the money will get back to taxpayers, and that's of top interest. So I'll turn it over to you if you could speak a little bit about the incentives and some of the data that you've been able to collect.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you, Charles and CRES, for this opportunity to be part of this conversation. Sort of the short answer to thinking about what kind of incentives work. We know that they've got to be simple to understand for the consumer, for the dealer, for everyone in the ecosystem. And they need to be part of a holistic program that really aligns all the market actors towards that common goal. To the short answer to your question about how do we make sure government spending has the effect we want, I think you'll see some of that in our approach, which is really making sure you have a dynamic, not a static research program that says here's a medium, low, high probability, but really a dynamic platform that provides the policymakers with the visualization so they can see the greenhouse gas reduction from different policy scenarios, EV adoption rates, and even look at the affordability calculator. We haven't talked much about equity yet, but we know that as you design these programs and to really be an effective market, we need everyone participating in this market. And policymakers have often told us, they're sitting in a committee room and at the state level and saying, well, we need some sort of low moderate income incentive. Well, let's do $1,000. Yeah, that sounds good. So really being able to take the guesswork out and saying, well, if you do $1,000 and you set your income level here, these are actual makes and models of vehicles that would be affordable to that household income. So really, and making sure that it's something that is dynamic and can change on an annual basis. We have seen in the programs we administer, and we support 6 statewide EV programs and have done about over $1 billion worth of EV incentives and more than 500,000 EV rebates. So we have a passing familiarity with these issues, but we've seen sort of legislators will sometimes say, here's the incentive rate, here's the eligible vehicles, and be very prescriptive, which makes it very difficult to have a flexible program that can be adjusted based on real market data. So, we think about really transforming this market and accelerating the adoption of this new technology. And so we really need to bring all the market actors into the system, which, for EVs includes OEMs, includes auto dealers, EV charging providers, utilities, electricians, consumers, of course, as well. And what the data shows is that consumer adoption of EVs is more than just price. It's not just the price of the vehicle. There are a number of social cultural elements that need to be addressed. And those are the infrastructure, right? There are also the types of vehicles that are available. The range, there's a whole facet of things, especially in our culture, that you would need to overcome. So governments, really should understand how their investment is leading to the goals that they've set out. You really need to identify and quantify the interaction of all these actors and the types and level of incentives that's needed to really reach that inflection point that can turn that linear adoption rate to exponential. So that's sort of the quick answer. I can go into more in terms of how we are experienced with these programs and how we sort of marry our experience with that $1 billion, 500,000 EVs, and the EV infrastructure programs with the data we gathered from that, as well as from jurisdictions around the US and internationally, and then using the analytical framework, which Jesse will provide greater detail on later, paired with socio-technical science and math to help policymakers quantify the outcomes based on the interactions of a holistic incentive program.
Thanks, Karen.
Sure.
That's a really big deal, and I just want to underscore that the model and the data that you've been able to look at is tracking $1 billion in terms of how that's flowed over time, and I think that that's of great benefit. So certainly appreciate you all digging into the data, and then being able to share that with us in terms of the model a little bit later. But I do want to dive in and jump into another round robin here, and this is really for anyone to chime in, but maybe Natasha and Paul, since I think you both mentioned this in passing. I want to talk about fleet vehicles, or talk about ways that we can take big bites out of the apple. And Jamie and Karen, feel free to jump in here too. But what are some of the big wins that we could see from medium, heavy-duty vehicles? Because at the end of the day, those are the cars that are on the road the most. I drove into Washington, D.C. today from Annapolis. It's the first time I've drove in weeks. And even when I was driving a lot, I was driving for just an hour or two a day, whereas these heavy and medium duty trucks, they're on the road constantly. These are the things that are delivering packages and helping to move folks, goods, and services around the country. Let's talk about that a little bit. I'm not sure who wants to jump in first. How do we take some big bites out of the apple with some of these bigger vehicles?
Natasha, feel free to go first.
I'll go ahead and paint a broad brush. We're definitely hearing a lot of excitement, especially around the medium and heavy duty vehicles that have shorter routes, right? School buses, local buses, refuse trucks. All of those vehicles that tend to, have short routes each day, charge at regular times, charge in regular depots, are very often a really great opportunity for electrification. And additionally, fleets have greater opportunities in the sense that many companies have a greater ability to absorb a longer payback period. Government agencies, would love to save money over a longer frame. It doesn't have to pay itself back in 2 or 3 years, which may be the case of some families, or less, right? Some really can't absorb that kind of a payback shock, but companies may be able to do so and may be able to clock on those benefits. You also have the real opportunity, going back to my point about grid benefits and the potential for us to start having a real conversation about not just vehicle to grid integration, which is the very, really the advanced digitized opportunity of integrating those two, but even just smart charging. When you're able to modulate how a large heavy duty vehicle charges based on the needs of the grid, could unlock a huge amount of value. So there's still a lot of work, and there's still a great amount of diversity out there for how those transitions are being managed. But it does seem like the stars are really aligning for that sector to move. Paul, what do you think?
Well, I couldn't agree more. I also want to talk about a couple of policies that are really showing the potential to help shape this this part of the transition. One is the California Advanced Clean Truck Rule, and the other is a low carbon fuel standard. And California has both. Oregon has a low carbon fuel standard, and the state of New York is in active consideration of both, as are a number of other jurisdictions. And it's very, very helpful to the manufacturers of the vehicles to have some sense of what the policy framework is going to look like, so that they know that there is going to be a market, because jurisdictions as large as the ones I just mentioned are basically laying out a timeline by which sales of medium and heavy duty vehicles need to be zero emission vehicles. And that really helps drive change in a more orderly way. There's another component of this that we've given a lot of thought to, and that is the value and the impact of public health improvements from electrification of fleets, and particularly fleets of diesel vehicles. We recently completed a community-based participatory research project with the New Jersey EJ Alliance, where we looked at the port-adjacent area of Newark, New Jersey. And what it showed is that the PM and NOx emissions, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions from diesel vehicles going in and out of the port of New York and New Jersey, have very pronounced local impacts in neighborhoods that were already overburdened by the other sources of air pollution in the region. But it is possible now, in the very near future, to begin to do something about that by moving to electrified medium and heavy duty vehicles. And this is going to be especially true as places like the area around both the seaport and the airport in northern New Jersey become major logistics hubs for the way that we now do commerce. And Amazon and others are building massive logistics warehouses in those communities, or are planning to. And it's very important that the vehicles be as clean as possible. This has, of course, very significant implications for the local utility infrastructure. And so planning around how to make sure that the grid is both resilient and capable of handling the loads, but is also providing the cleanest possible electrons really becomes paramount. And I'm happy to say that the 16-state ZEV MOU task force on medium and heavy duty vehicles is super focused on this. We have been providing them sort of a structured input from all of the electric companies in those jurisdictions, and happy to say that that's a process that seems to be getting ready to yield an action plan middle of this year.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to hear you talk about the ZEV MOU for medium and heavy duty trucks. That's definitely important. And Jamie and Karen, I'm going to give you a chance to jump in here for a second. But I think that, Paul, what you talked about in terms of the new type of commerce that we are likely to see, that we would have seen in the future maybe, but post-pandemic, the way that folks buy and shop for things and move around has changed dramatically. And I think that some of that is going to be permanent. And so understanding how the transportation sector can maybe not take advantage, but how we can leapfrog and get ahead of what otherwise would have been a slower transition is certainly important. And Natasha, what you said about electrifying trash trucks, I've got a 2-year-old daughter. Her favorite vehicle on the street is the trash truck. So as soon as that goes electric, we'll really be in business. But Jamie and Karen, I'm not sure if you have something that you want to add on the fleet side.
So you want to go ahead, Karen?
Sure. So I was just going to mention, while we think about fleets as the medium duty and heavy duty fleets, which are clearly there. And I did see a question in the chat box about hydrogen. And of course, there's a role for hydrogen on the medium duty, heavy duty fleet side. A lot of the EV light duty vehicle rebate programs we administer also include a light duty fleet component. So there are also these light duty fleets, and they're really an interesting market segment because obviously you can get great bang for your buck when you've got one fleet manager who oversees a number of vehicles. So I just wanted to make that distinction between the medium duty, heavy duty fleets and light duty fleets as well. Sorry, go ahead, Jamie.
So totally agree with pretty much everything that's been said. And these sort of central return to base, predictable duty cycle, it's a perfect use case for electrification. And I think one thing that is particularly relevant right now in a pandemic world is these delivery vans. I don't know about your neighborhood. I'm seeing an awful lot more of them. I think this is probably here to stay, and they're an ideal, use case to electrify. They, for the most part, do return to base. That you could have centralized depot charging. They're relatively short stop and go routes, so it makes a lot of sense. And I agree with Natasha that there's some interesting grid considerations here. Both on the centralized control side, that's great because it potentially opens up more opportunities for smart charging and vehicle grid integration. We also do need to think beyond planning about how we're going to build out this infrastructure. We need to bring a lot of power to these sites. These are big, complicated projects. Every site's a little bit different, and the lead time for doing these projects can be literally years. So this is a huge opportunity, but it's a perfect example of why we all need to work together and figure out, what are all of the policy elements we need in place to enable this to happen quickly. Agree with Karen that incentives, we do need to look at extending those potentially to fleet applications as well, whether on the light duty side or the heavy duty side. But yeah, this is exciting, and the impact of each one of these vehicles is meaningful, and that's why GM just announced, our right drop business, which includes an electric van, and we're not alone. Industry is really excited about electrifying this sector.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, all. It's great to hear. And Karen, I'm glad that you've got one eye on the Q&A. I will invite participants, if you do have questions, please do drop them into the chat. I'll ask one more question and then turn to some of what's been put in already. But I do want to ask, and we were talking about fleets and some of the heavy duty vehicles, the return to base, the return every night is a good thing and helpful for the business model for fleets right now. But for individuals, we do talk about range anxiety. Are those fears overblown? How has the technology matured and changed even in the last 2 years to either alleviate some of those concerns, or what needs to be done to build out the infrastructure so that for all the EVs on the road in 10 years, and this is, Natasha, as you mentioned, we're at the start of an exponential curve here. What needs to be done so that folks, if they're buying a car now, know that in 5 or 10 years there will be enough chargers with all the other people on the road to be able to get to where they're going?
If I might, we have been working with the Georgetown Climate Center and the Transportation Climate Initiative, which, by the way, TCI is more than just the cap and invest model. It has been a decades-long cooperative effort among the departments of transportation of the sort of the 12 largest jurisdictions in the East Coast, and now is expanding to include North Carolina. So we have developed a GIS-based mapping tool that enables policymakers to see what traffic patterns look like and to understand where there might be optimal locations for charging infrastructure, particularly for direct current fast charging infrastructure. So that we started with interstate systems and major thoroughfares, but we're expanding it to include, basically all freight travel corridors. And so that you can begin to sort of say, well, we think we're going to need a fair amount of infrastructure here because we've got high traffic volumes, but we may have the occasional but absolutely necessary charging that's needed at Lake Placid in New York, for example, even though it may not be as utilized as other locations. And this is extremely helpful to the utility companies because they can then say, all right, we can sort of see what the load is going to look like 5, 6, 7, 8 years out, and we can begin to tell you what that implies for the transmission system, what it implies for necessary new generation. So these things are susceptible to analysis, I guess, is the point I want to make. And so as we get better at this, and as the vehicles improve in range, and as the infrastructure begins to really approach scale, I firmly believe that this chicken and egg around range anxiety will diminish to the vanishing point. But we need to be, now at this stage, we need to be very, very focused on trying to get this right. And also, one last point, I think we have to recognize that we won't get it perfect. There will be things where we'll say, well, that particular investment probably didn't work out. It's very important that we learn from those kinds of failures, because they will be very, very instructive. And if we just have to adopt an approach where we can't ever make a bad investment, this will not go so well. We're going to have to approach this with a spirit of experimentation.
Thanks, Paul. That's helpful to hear. Go ahead, Natasha.
If I may just chime in, I really appreciate the examples you gave, Paul, and I would just add that, you know, you're also sort of aligning to the fact that some of these communities are really hard to reach. There are, you know, the geographic distribution of chargers is one of the inherent challenges to this problem, and it is a structural challenge. There are communities in this country where the underlying distribution infrastructure cannot sustain DC fast charging. Where do you start if you're trying to ensure access in those areas? There are rural communities that have a real potential benefit that may lack some of the basic infrastructure, even things as simple as broadband. So, you know, there are just some areas where we have some real gaps to fill, but it's a great opportunity to think about more data-based approaches, more scientific structuring for how you target those areas and how you support them, and make sure, as Jamie said earlier, that this really works for all.
I guess I would just add, and as well, sort of when you started, Charles, you were sort of mentioning how things have changed and improvements with EVs. So I've been driving an EV. Actually, I'm on my 4th generation Nissan Leaf for about a decade now, actually a little bit more than a decade. And I can sort of bear witness to these incredible improvements in range and charging speed. And I would add, as a Vermonter, to cabin heating as well. No longer do I need to wear 2 pairs of socks, long johns, and have a jacket on, which I did with my 1st generation Leaf. That's really improved dramatically. But we do know from the literature that, you know, consumers need to be able to see how this technology, this vehicle, is going to work for them. And that includes answering the question of, where will I charge it? How will I charge it? And we know there are garage orphans that will need public or workplace charging. And then for that long distance travel charging, whether it's the Thanksgiving trip to grandma or the summer trip to the beach, you need to have those public DC fast charging as well. We also know from our experience and from the literature that EV charging serves as an accelerant to EV adoption. As folks see it, they get it. And ideally, there's sort of this build ahead of sort of 2 years in advance is what the literature is suggesting of when you want to see the vehicles arrive. So you don't have them happening simultaneously. You identify how many vehicles you anticipate 2 years ahead, get that infrastructure in the ground, and where you put it is critical as well. And that sort of the final piece around EV charging, Natasha was talking a bit about broadband for these communities and other elements that are needed, is thinking about EV charging is also supporting and creating local community development. So it not only serves as an amenity and as an attraction for people to stop and recharge their cars or shop and dine or go to a movie or live performance, all of which sounds wonderful to be able to do, and we will. But just, that notion that it's an attraction and it's this magic box that has these tentacles that can include broadband, can include grid services, and can include a number of elements, and it is a community development tool as well. So it's a multifaceted benefit.
Thanks, Karen.
And I'll just quickly say, so yeah, range is improving. Range will continue to improve. That doesn't mean that we don't need to build out a lot more infrastructure. DC fast charging is going to be really essential. But as Karen noted, I think it's really important as we look to get to an all electric future, we have to get beyond the early adopters who, for the most part, live in single family homes and have garages. And we need to figure out charging solutions for people who don't, for renters, for people in apartment buildings, and everyone's still working on this. How do we get into all these multi-unit dwellings? It's not easy. We also think that urban and suburban clusters of DC fast chargers can, serve some of those needs. So range is going to continue to improve, but we need to get to the point where these vehicles can serve all of your needs and people don't see any sort of compromise here. And So that means more range, and it also means more ubiquitous charging.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. There's been a lot of good points, put out on the table just in response to this question. It's really impressive, and for me, it's not just about the charging stations that you actually attach to, but the underlying infrastructure that in some places does not exist to be able to help make this transition possible. Or if it does exist, the conversation nationally focusing on resiliency and being able to withstand, natural hazards and whatnot is of even more importance to the greater extent we link our transportation sector to the power sector. And so being able to keep those lights on, lived my whole life being able to wake up first thing in the morning and flick on the light switch, and that's due to 100 years worth of infrastructure that has been built to keep the lights on. The problem is some of that infrastructure is like 100 years old and is in desperate need of repair and rehabilitation and upgrades. So we're coming up where we're just about to transition over to Jesse and be able to dive in a little bit more. We've got a couple of questions that we just weren't able to get to and get answered here. But I do invite folks to be able to follow up with our panelists afterwards and be able to continue this conversation. So I'll bring it over to Jesse here so that you can dive in a little bit more. Show us about the Caret model. 100 different dimensions, 100 different knobs that can be turned to help identify where the right place for incentives might be. One of the questions that was put into the panel and into the chat, I'm not sure if the tool can answer it, is separate from incentives that are just at the point of sale or with the consumer. Is there a way to look at incentives that are further upstream for the company or for a fleet or something like that? If you can help paint the picture of what the tool does, where those different intervention points are, I think that will be very helpful. So Jesse, I'll turn it over to you, and if you can walk us through this tool, that would be great.
Thanks, Charles. I'll say right out of the gate, yes, the tool can be used to develop those estimates. My name's Jesse MG. I'm the Chief Scientist and Director of the Transparency and Insights team at the Center for Sustainable Energy. The TNI team, briefly, is effectively a full-service evaluation, big data analytics, and business intelligence organization within CSE. Everything from traditional ex-post evaluation to advanced data analytics, some of which I'm going to show you today. Let's see, my background, I hold a PhD in international political economy and econometrics. I spent the last decade or so working with various policymakers and program managers, primarily in California, understanding how to best leverage incentives to design and drive program performance. Over the last year at CSE, we've been building the analytics tool I'm going to talk to you about today. Please interrupt me with any questions. I can't see you guys, so that will help me out. I'm trying to do two things today. First is I want to give you some considerations around designing EV programs specifically, but these considerations apply to program design generally and really any business intelligence type decision that you're making. The second is to show you Caret, which is as Karen said, is CSE's light duty vehicle EV decision-making platform, which allows policymakers and planners the ability to iterate on various incentive programs designs at various points of intervention, or other policy interventions like ZEV mandates, and then understand the associated impacts to EV adoption, ICE vehicle adoption, GHGs avoided, charging needed, costs year over year, and in total, and our simulation goes up to 30 years. Next slide, please, Rebecca. I'm going a little fast here to fit it in. Okay, so Karen mentioned the idea of a connection between sort of domain data and data analytics. And this is kind of the idea that I want to explore with you all today. So again, stay with me here. I can't see your faces. Get comfortable. Let's think about the last time you made plans to go somewhere. So sometime 800 years ago in early 2020, and let's take the phone out of it for a second, right? So let's not quickly go to our cell phone. So maybe tomorrow you're picking up the kids from school, right? You might want to plan for this. Well, you might think about the state of the world today, right? The pickup line is always such a nightmare. But for some reason, Main Street is a little quieter on Thursdays, unless it's raining, and maybe a few other considerations that you understand to be true of the world around you. You then try to predict the future, right? Tomorrow's Thursday, great, maybe I'll take Main Street, but there's clouds in the sky, so maybe not. Right now, you'll probably do this a couple of times before you head out tomorrow. Maybe you just do it sort of, subconsciously in your head. And then while you're en route, inevitably there'll be an issue. You'll be deviated from your planned route, and you'll end up at the end of the line, right? Another point you may consider in your future forecasting of your travel plans. Okay, so what am I talking about? I'm not sure that I know. Well, you basically just completed an evaluation exercise in your head, right? You've done this entire evaluation cycle that's to the left here. You even introduced some advanced big data analytics. You are now all data scientists. Congratulations. So you established the current state of the world, which allowed you to understand something about the future, which allowed you to plan for it. So now let's think about EVs, right? Planners and policymakers need to do exactly this activity, right? They need to know where EVs and ICE vehicles are today, who is driving what, where they are, how much, how far, are they being driven, for how long are they being owned, are they owned, are they leased, and many other factors. So with those observations, we start to identify patterns in our world. And those patterns allow us to, or some combination of those patterns allow us to look at the impacts of our world tomorrow, right, given these various considerations. And this is really critical, right? This allows us to predict where the market will go without any intervention, right? This is our baseline scenario, either from regulators, legislators, or others. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, Rebecca. Thank you. Okay, so a bunch of questions here about EVs, right? We're talking about data a little bit here. If you can one back. Sorry, I think my bandwidth's a little slow today. Thank you. Okay, so data and the process for sort of systematic data collection and analysis. Bunch of EV questions here on the left. So if you can answer any of these data questions, you're probably doing better than many policymakers in the space, frankly. And this is not a knock on anyone. This data is extremely complicated. It's hard to collect, it's hard to manage, and it's hard to analyze. But with answering these questions to the left, you've likely created a world with dozens of dimensions, right? Caret currently has about 90. So how can a policymaker possibly or reasonably track, consider, weigh every dimension to understand the effects of any one intervention or multiple interventions, right? An incentive or otherwise, or even the lack thereof of intervention. This is where the data science and analytics is rather helpful. Our tool, which is Caret, is built on academically driven data science. It allows a policymaker the ability to iterate on designs they believe to be effective, right? Bringing in their domain knowledge and see what the likely outcome in terms of costs, again, GHGs and EV market share. Next slide, please, Rebecca. So a little bit about Caret. Remember your trip tomorrow, going to pick up the kids? And I said, forget about the phone for a moment. So let's reinsert the phone, right? This is our little, this little tool helps us achieve an awful lot. Now, how do you plan, right? You take the data that you have the address of the school, you know that you have an app on your phone, you strip away all the unnecessary observations and relationships that are spurious at best, right? Like this rain thing, come on, I don't know. All the other noise is eliminated. And you bring your domain knowledge, right? That you have a tool and it's a car, you know how to drive it. And the phone provides the analytics, right? You don't have to do the complicated considerations in your head. You don't have to try to track multiple dimensions. Picking up your kids easy, right? But planning an EV program 15 years into the future becomes increasingly complicated, right? So basically the Caret is the phone for EVs. It allows you to inform a data painted picture of the world with robust data from CSE, as well as specific data from your territory. And then it allows you, the domain expert, to iterate on reasonable and frankly unreasonable program designs, including the mentioned incentives, mandates, and others. Next slide, please. 2 minutes, I think I could do it. All right. A very important point. None of this is stagnant, right? So why do some of us input the same address in Google Maps every day? because the world changes all the time, right? As does the data that reflects that world. So have you heard this idea that more data has been generated in the last 3 years than all of human history combined? All I can see is Charles. Think about that statement, right? Barring a zombie apocalypse, that will always be true going forward, right? That's going to be true next year, the year after, the year after. One of the most critical things about any big data analysis activity, including Caret, is the ability to incorporate new data to further refine our interventions to produce the most cost-effective results year over year, right? To make sure that we're getting to where we want to get. So Caret includes a learning algorithm to do just that, incorporate new real-world data, and it allows very targeted cost effectiveness. Okay, next slide, please. I think I have 1 minute. All right, so what does this all look like? And this is sort of the teaser, and I don't really have time for a demo clearly, but please reach out to me and we can set one up and walk through your individual considerations. This first visualization, let's see. The first visualization is costs associated with a theoretical large-scale national program. You can see each individual element here. There's a scrap and replace program, a dealer incentive, a used EV incentive, made in America incentive. Really, the takeaway here is that this thing is showing you costs over 20 years, and these are all dependent on inputs that the user, you or someone on your team or a policymaker or program designer in El Salvador are putting into the platform. Next slide, please. Charles, should I finish it up?
Yeah, if you could maybe go through the next 1 or 2 slides, we can go over by just a minute.
So we've got the next slide. This is giving you projected EV market penetration year over year till 2040, right? An important point here that I want to make is, again, this could either reflect an incentive program that's being considered, or it could reflect business as usual, right? And we can understand what's going to happen in an individual territory, absent of a program and with the program. I could probably stop there. We've got, I think we're up to about 25 different visualizations. We have hundreds of different outputs, and would love to show it to you folks.
Thanks, Jesse. Really appreciate it. And Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, we wanted to be able to help showcase the Caret tool. We're big believers in being able to use data to drive policy and data that's as accurate as possible on the ground. And so for the years of data that have been collected and tracking all that spending by Karen and Jesse, much appreciated. And we do hope that we can help inform and improve better policy, not just at the federal level, but at the state level as well. So I do want to wrap up here and just thank all of our speakers again, Jamie, Natasha, Paul, Karen, and Jesse. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. We didn't get to a lot of the questions that came in late. That's usually what happens, but that just goes to show the interest that we did have here. I know that some folks weren't able to join the live stream due to a technical issue. I got a couple of different messages on that, but this will be posted to YouTube and be widely available, and we'll be sure to follow up with folks. So thanks very much for your time today, and we'll see you in a month where we'll be focusing on natural solutions to climate change. Thanks all. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.